Welcome back to Face the Nation. We turn now to our Holly Williams in Erbil for more on the escalating conflict in the Mideast.
The U.S. says the strikes on Yemen last night targeted Houthi missile systems and launchers, as well as weapons storage and radars used by the group. A spokesman for the Houthis, who are supported by Iran, said the strikes will not deter them. The group says its assault on commercial and naval ships in the Red Sea, which started in November, is an expression of solidarity with Palestinians under bombardment in Gaza. The strikes in Yemen come just one day after the U.S. says it hit 85 targets here in Iraq and in neighbouring Syria that are used by Iranian forces and militia groups backed by Iran. There's been an uptick in those militia groups targeting the U.S. military in this region since the Israel-Hamas war began, with around 170 attacks using rockets and drones. The U.S. strikes reportedly killed around 40 people, including both fighters and civilians, and were retaliation for the deaths of 3 American soldiers in a drone attack a week ago at a military outpost in Jordan. There are around 2,500 U.S. troops based here in Iraq and around 900 over the border in Syria. Iran called America's response a, quote, strategic mistake. But the question now is whether the militia groups it backs will ratchet things up even further. When we interviewed Iran's foreign minister, Hossein Amir Abdollahian, in November, he claimed the militia groups in Iraq and Syria make their own independent calculations and decisions. There have long been fears that the Israel-Hamas war could widen into a regional conflict, likely involving Iran's proxies. Ironically, just a few years ago, the U.S. and the Iran-backed militia groups were essentially on the same side in a different conflict, the war against ISIS. Now, the U.S. appears to be trying to carefully calibrate its response. On the one hand, it doesn't want a further escalation of violence here in the Middle East. But on the other, it doesn't want to risk emboldening its enemies.
That's Holly Williams in Erbil. We turn now to the leaders of the House Intelligence Committee, Republican Mike Turner, who's in Dayton, Ohio this morning, and Democrat Jim Himes, who's in Stamford, Connecticut. Welcome to you both.
Thanks. Thank you for having us.
Chair Turner, the Speaker of the House criticized the Biden administration for public hand-wringing, excessive signaling ahead of these strikes, saying that it undercuts the U.S. ability to put a stop to the attacks. Do you accept the explanation that you heard from Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor?
Right. So, Margaret, I think that they have confusion among their goals and objectives. They keep shifting as to what they're trying to achieve with the attacks, and really what their policy is with respect to response. You know, that Secretary Austin, Secretary of Defense, said that when Americans are attacked, we will respond. However, that's not true. They've tolerated over 160 of these attacks.
They've been carrying out strikes
these
against
attacks,
some of them.
In minor areas, nothing to actually counter what is occurring here. And that's the issue. But you also heard with Jake Sullivan, then he said when there are attacks or deaths of American service members, we will respond. He was coupling it to both, which is what they've done here. But this is the problem, Margaret. They keep saying that they want to retaliate, but then they say it's about deterrence. Then they say it's about diminishing capabilities. Those are all different goals and objectives, and they're not doing any of those. We all know that this is just about Iran. These are all franchises of Iran, and the administration has no policy with respect to Iran, how to diminish their capability, diminish these attacks, and diminish their nefarious activities in the Middle East.
Congressman Himes, how do you respond to that? And I know you have said that you hoped these strikes would cause significant pain to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Jake Sullivan says they still don't know if they were able to take out any personnel from the IRGC.
Yeah. Look, Margaret, I respectfully disagree with Chairman Turner. What needs to happen here is exceedingly clear. There are two things that must happen. Number one, we must make it very clear to the Iranian and to the Iranian-backed militias that attacks on U.S. Troops, on U.S. assets, will be enormously expensive. And I think we are in the process of doing that. And number two, the other objective, of course, is we don't want to go to war with Iran. That, by the way, is an objective that Iran shares. They don't want to go to war with us. So there is a certain amount of ambiguity in this. And what you do is you listen to what the other side's red lines are. The Iranians, I think, would regard, for example, an attack on their territory, certainly the killing of civilians inside Iran, as a red line that they would then be forced to react to. The chairman was just not right when he said that they hadn't responded, the administration hadn't responded to the many, many attacks, the 160 attacks. Those attacks were proportional. The Iranians, in a dark way, got lucky in their ability in Tower 22 to take out 3 Americans. That obviously requires a much more dramatic response than the earlier attacks in which we didn't suffer casualties. And that, of course, is what their militias in Syria and Iraq have experienced over the course of the last 24 hours and will continue to experience, I think, for the next couple of days.
Mm-hmm. I think you're referring to the strikes on like January, I think it was January 3rd or January 24th that were militia people targeted by the United States, but not the kind of B-1 bomber mission we just saw carried out on Friday. Chair Turner.
That's right. The B-1s come out when
right.
When Americans are killed. When
right.
they're not killed, the response is obviously going to be less dramatic.
Right. But to the point, it hasn't deterred the continued tit-for-tat attacks, which, by the way, Chair Turner, you would acknowledge those were going on before October 7th. Those have been going on for years.
For some time, and this administration has responded incredibly poorly. You know, one is a result of the other. If you tolerate attacks, you are going to tolerate that you're going to have casualties. And the problem here is that the administration, back to goals and objectives, has no goal and objective. Iran pays no price when militias are attacked. The militias don't care. And when you diminish their capability for the moment that you've struck them, you haven't diminished their overall capability. These attacks are still going to happen. The administration needs 2 things: a real plan with respect to Iran and countering Iran in the area, but secondly, diminishing capacity to stop these attacks. We can't play defense forever. Our systems to protect our troops and our ships cannot continually respond to these attacks with 100% success. Tolerating the attacks tolerates casualties. We need to diminish their capability, and we need to take this problem to Iran.
Let me ask you, Congressman Turner, Speaker Johnson said he's putting forward a standalone Israel security bill for about $17.5 billion. You only have 219 Republicans in the House, and one of them has already said he's not on board with this. This does not look like it has an easy path forward. What does this do to complicate all the other significant national security priorities that I know you support, like Ukraine? Isn't this just a political statement?
Well, I'm very concerned about that strategy. I was very concerned when we did it last year, and they brought up a Israel bill that was paid for. This one, importantly, does not have a pay for. I think that we really have 4 significant national security threats. We have Asia, we have Ukraine, we have Israel and what's going on in the Middle East, and of course we have our border. And right now we've been proceeding on negotiations on those 4. Ukraine has to be funded. We have to respond to Russian aggression, or we will have a broader war there. And also, the atrocities that Russia has been undertaking in Ukraine need to be responded to. Of course, we have to respond and support Israel. And again, back to our activities in the area, we need to make certain that we're responding to the nefarious actions of Iran in the region. So I do think that all these are coupled.
And so that would suggest you don't like the standalone bill strategy.
I'm very concerned about this process. Now, the Speaker has said openly that he fully supports the funding for Ukraine. We have to make certain that there is a path to do that. The Ukrainians are getting to the point where it's critical that the funding come through. And I certainly am looking forward to the Speaker describing, if he's going to piecemeal this, how each of these pieces get accomplished.
And Congressman Himes, Democrats may end up having to essentially deliver the votes to allow that to pass. I know you have said on another network, referencing this very thin majority that the Republicans have and threats by some of the Republican members to oust the Speaker, you linked his survival to whether he works with Democrats to pass Ukraine aid. Are Democrats offering Johnson protection here from his own party?
Well, the move he's taken to offer an Israel-only deal is very dirty pool. It's an act of staggering bad faith. Why do I say that? Because and Mike and I were in the Situation Room when the brand new speaker laid out for the National Security Advisor, the way we're going to do this is we're going to do a border deal as a condition to doing Ukraine aid, and then we'll do, it'll be a package with Ukraine, with Israel money, and with Indo-PACOM money. That's for East Asia. Before the wording of a bipartisan border deal was even available to anybody, at a time in which Mitch McConnell was saying, we will never get a border deal that is better than this one. Mike and I both heard him say that in the cabinet room. The speaker said it's dead on arrival. It will not happen. So I don't have quite Mike's optimism here. I think what's happening here is that the speaker is taking a move to get Israel aid done, which we all support, most of us support, I shouldn't say all, but that will allow him to ultimately not do a border deal, because there are Republicans, Mike Turner not amongst them, who would rather that problem be an issue in November and that it not be solved. And there are roughly 50%, we know this from the votes, of Republicans who oppose Ukraine aid. So as much as it is important for us to provide aid to Israel, this is the first step in getting aid to Israel at the expense of any aid to Ukraine and at the expense of a generational opportunity to actually get a border immigration deal done.
So your offer essentially to protect Speaker Johnson from a motion to vacate is off the table.
Well, no, step back to that question. First of all, I didn't offer to protect the speaker. I made the point in the cabinet room that we were all agreeing on the importance of Ukraine aid and the importance of a good border deal. The president said he will shut down the border. He will do a big deal. So the challenge becomes, how do we position the two congressional leaders who matter in the House, Hakeem Jeffries and Speaker Johnson, who I pointed out was in a very precarious position.
Yes.
How do we position them to get to yes? And the reality is that with a whatever two-vote majority, anything that gets done in the House of Representatives, anything, will get done with some Democratic help. So how do we tee up the position to move forward in a bipartisan way? And here's the challenge for the speaker: any bipartisan activity, certainly activity that requires a lot of Democrats, puts him in great peril. And of course, he thinks about that.
Right. Chair Turner, you called the border the most significant present national security threat in previous interviews. I know you haven't seen the text, but you just heard Senator Sinema lay out in great detail what she has helped put together. Did you like what you heard?
Well, I think those are certainly important elements, and we do have to, I mean, in any instance, we have to see the bill. And I just want to compliment Jim Himes one more time. We work on a very bipartisan basis, and despite our disagreements on the administration's Iran policy, but you heard him say, this is really a very difficult process to get all of this done. The over 300 members have always voted for these funding packages. Everyone recognizes these are national security threats, and we need to find a path to get these done. Now, on the border, FBI Director Wray has said that we have the highest threat right now for the possibility of a terrorist attack on U.S. soil as a result of the open border and the people who have come into the United States. We don't know where they are, some of which who have allegiance to international terrorist groups and organizations. The FBI director himself has said that. I think that that certainly should be part of the impetus for everyone to look to, how do we resolve this issue?
In other words, you can't wait for the election to be over. There should be a bill voted on, and you're open to voting for this one.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. Okay. This is an issue that needs to be addressed now, and I look forward to reading the text and seeing what's in the bill. And this certainly is one of the highest priorities.
And Congressman Himes, there are some congressional Democrats, including from the Hispanic caucus, who are already complaining about this, even though the text is not out. Do you think Democrats will ultimately come out to support this bill the White House negotiated?
I do, Margaret, and you're exactly right. And I've heard, we have a general sense of what's in the bill, and yes, there is dramatic concern in the let's call it the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. But the president has said, and Mike and I heard this 3 times in the cabinet room, that he will go big. It is clear on a bipartisan basis. If you have eyes, you understand that we have a crisis at the southern border, and it needs to be fixed. And so the challenge here is, and I go back to what I told you previously, how do we put the two leaders in a position to do a very hard thing? Because immigration border deals are very hard. There's a reason we haven't done one in 40 or 50 years. They're very, very hard. And again, I'm not looking necessarily to protect Mike Johnson, but Mike Johnson is a very precariously situated Speaker of the House. And so the question is, how do we get instincts like Mike Turner's to prevail in the Republican Party? And how do we get enough Democratic votes on the left to make sure that we take advantage of this truly generational opportunity? Again, don't listen to me about this. Mitch McConnell in the cabinet room said, if we had Donald Trump as president, a Republican Senate, and a Republican House, we would not get this deal. So my hope is that the two parties can come together to get it done.
Well, we will see. And gentlemen, we appreciate you speaking in this bipartisan fashion and joining us both today. We'll be right back. For some analysis on the situation in the Middle East, we turn now to the former head of U.S. Central Command, General Frank McKenzie. He was in charge of U.S. forces in the Middle East for 3 years under the Trump and Biden administrations. Welcome back.
Good to be here, Margaret.
General, how would you assess the impact of the strikes so far, which you just heard National Security Advisor Sullivan say is just the beginning?
I think that's pretty accurate. I don't think we know yet. I think it's going to require more work. And I think we do need to have an understanding of what we want as an end state. For me as the operational commander, back when I was in command, it would be that they cease attacks on our bases and operating positions in Iraq and Syria. That's a pretty clear end state. You know, the problem is there's a lot of talk about Iran actually not giving the order for this specific attack. And there's some truth to that, because around 2020, Iran began to give blanket clearance to these groups to attack United States positions in Iraq and Syria. So they now operate under a sort of procedure where there's no mother may I. They have the opportunity to generate these attacks without directly going back to Iran. And while Iran is certainly ultimately complicit because they provide the weapons, they provide the training, they provide the funding, in some cases they probably provide some targeting assistance, it's hard sometimes to find that track back for a specific attack because of the way Iran has ingeniously designed their command and control process.
Mm-hmm. That is important context on the question of whether they have control or not. You, before this devastating attack that killed 3 American service people, you were on the record in a Wall Street Journal editorial saying the U.S., you referenced the president saying the U.S. doesn't want to escalate. And you said, unfortunately, it is the U.S. that is being deterred, not Iran and its proxies. To reset deterrence, we must apply violence Tehran understands. What would that look like?
Margaret, and I first of all, I still stand by those words. I think this particular campaign we're on, we've done 2 things that I think undercut us. First of all, there's a continual reference in our policy statements about not wanting to escalate. Look, I agree, escalation is dangerous, but if the greatest fear is escalation, we should leave. We can reduce the danger of escalation to 0 if we leave. Clearly, we have higher priorities than preventing escalation. So we should recognize that. The second part is we have explicitly taken Iran itself off the list of potential targets in this campaign. I am not advocating for striking Iran. I am advocating that they need to be in the space of possible targets so that they're held at risk. What happens when we say, well, we're going to strike targets in Iraq and Syria, we're not going to strike targets in Iran, at least kinetically targets in Iran? That gives them aid and comfort. That's not a good thing to do. And what we want to do is induce in their minds, in their cognitive space, a concern about continuing on this path and what it might mean to them. Look, Iranian foreign policy is built on 3 things. It's built on preservation of the theocratic regime, number 1, above all others. Number 2, the destruction of the state of Israel. Number 3, the ejection of the United States from the region. Mm-hmm. Number 1 is a point of strength for them, but also a point of weakness. And I believe we are consciously neglecting it in this campaign.
4 years ago, they were forces under your command who killed Iran's Quds Force commander Qasem Soleimani when he was in Iraq from Iran. His successor doesn't seem to be quite as influential, and there are some pointing to the leader of Hezbollah now as choreographing the militias. Is this the outcome you expected when the Trump administration decided to take Soleimani off the battlefield?
Well, Margaret, it's important to understand we took Soleimani off the battlefield because we felt He was preparing an imminent attack on our embassy and other locations in the Middle East. So certainly there were long-term considerations, but he was a clear and present immediate danger, and we took steps to remove him from the battlefield because of that. Now, what's developed after that? You're right. The IRGC Quds Force has not been able to get into Iraq and bring people together as Soleimani was, because his successor is a much weaker military leader than Soleimani. It's unclear to me that Nasrallah, the leader of Lebanese Hezbollah, is filling that space. I think the most interesting thing about Lebanese Hezbollah and Nasrallah is the fact he has not chosen to engage in large-scale conflict with Israel right now because of what's going on down in Gaza. And I think that's important to look at. It's like the dog that doesn't bark in the night. That can be important. He's instead chosen to hold back, to observe the situation, and I think that's an important thing that we should continue to take a look at, because they're the largest non-state military entity in the world with thousands of weapons that could cause great pain to Israel. On the other hand, Israel has vast resources they could apply against Lebanese Hezbollah should this war ensue. And I don't think LH wants that war. Now, they may be influencing events in Syria and Iraq. That's just not known to me at this time. I think it's more of a hodgepodge of efforts there, but I do believe ultimately Iran is clearly behind it.
U.S. intelligence estimates Israeli forces have killed about 20 to 30% of Hamas fighters since October. That is far short of destroying Hamas. How do you judge the level of success of Israel's campaign?
It's very limited so far. I think they set themselves a goal of removing the political echelon and the military leadership echelon of Hamas when they went in. They have not been successful to date at doing either. And these campaigns are nonlinear, so they don't necessarily go from day to day. You could have a big breakthrough here and things could change suddenly on the ground. But I think the larger issue, at least for me, looking at it, is you have to have a theory for what it's going to look like when it's over. What's going to happen in Gaza, and we've had some people that have talked about it earlier on the show today. And I think it's important to consider that. You need a vision of an end state when you begin a military campaign, because everything you do then subtracts or adds to your ability to get to that point. And I would argue that needs to be something like a two-state solution. You're going to need help from the Arab nations in the region to go in there and do something in Gaza. I think Israeli occupation would be the least desirable of all outcomes.
General McKenzie, thank you for your expertise. We'll be back in a moment. President Biden won the South Carolina primary yesterday with over 96% of the vote in the state that helped revive his campaign 4 years ago. That's it for us today. Thank you all for watching. Until next week. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.